Besides being the longest lasting empire in world history, they're also known for their invention and innovative creations that shook and shaped the world, like creating the world's first official compass, paper money, to even gunpowder. But what else occurred in ancient China that we may not really know about? Hi, my name is Jessa, and please join me as we look together our top 10 disturbing ancient China facts that will leave you speechless. Oh yeah, and also before we begin, in the last video I was in, top 10 unusual ancient tomb discoveries you've never seen before, I gave you guys a riddle. Did you get it? The riddle was, I have no life, but I can die. What am I? The answer is, drumroll please, a battery. Your next riddle will be at the end of this video. Anyways, let's get started. Number 10, Aeronautics. Although this isn't necessarily disturbing, it was definitely cool. Might even make you speechless, who knows. But to me, I found this pretty darn cool. By 4th century CE, a common toy in China was the helicopter top known as the bamboo dragonfly. The top was an axis with a cord wound around it and with blades sticking out from the axis and set an angle. Once you pulled the cord and the top went climbing into the air, it would propel just like a helicopter. Sir George Cayley, the father of the modern aeronautics, actually studied Chinese helicopter top in 1809, and the helicopter top in China led to nothing but amusement and pleasure. But 1400 years later, it was to be one of the key elements in the birth of modern aeronautics in the West. And considering their invention of the helicopter or the concept of the propeller that could be used to move, they were also noted for their achievements in developing rockets, specifically fireworks. Around 1150, the development of a comet-like fireworks to a 4-foot bamboo stick with an arrowhead and a balancing weight behind the feathers was created, and to make rockets multi-staged, a secondary set of rockets were attached to the shaft and their fuses lighted. This was noted as the first rocket that burned out, and in the wake of Marco Polo, rockets were first mentioned in the West in the connection with the battle in Italy in 1380. Number 9. Holy Relations. Also known as the Taiping Rebellion, a peasant named Hong Xiuquan revolted against the Qing dynasty. Truthfully, he believed it was because he was the half-brother or the younger brother of Jesus after he had a dream that he was related to him and decided to go ham on that dream. He declared himself a heavenly king, and he implemented an economic system that somewhat resembled communism. The Taiping Rebellion, in its summation, was a revolt against the Qing dynasty in China and fought the religious conviction over regional economic conditions and lasted from 1850 to 1864. Hong abolished private property, separated men and women, and enforced strict religious laws. Taiping Christianity placed little emphasis on the New Testament ideas of kindness, forgiveness, and redemption, but instead it emphasizes the wrathful Old Testament God who demanded worship and obedience. The Taiping Rebellion was the brutal civil war in the history of China and quite possibly the most destructive war in the whole history of war. Yet few outside of China know very much about the course of this titanic conflict or even that it happened at all. Number 8. Terracotta Army. In ancient Egypt, when the pharaoh died, he would sometimes have his servants, his spouses, his concubines, even his pets die along with him to join him into the afterlife. For the Emperor King Shi Huang, who was the first emperor of China, he needed an army to protect him in his afterlife. The Terracotta Army is part of the world's largest ancient imperial tomb complex, Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum. About 8,000 different life-size statues have been uncovered, and it is the largest of its kind. The statues are roughly 175 to 190 centimeters tall, and the Terracotta Army was actually accidentally discovered when farmer Yang Zifa uncovered fragments of pottery when digging a well. This pottery led to the discovery of the first warrior of the famous Terracotta Army. There was also no historical records of them ever existing at all, so they had just sat untouched underground for more than 2,200 years. This only adds to the mystery, as it is now the largest and most important tomb site in China. More recent discoveries including terracotta acrobats, strongmen, another pit containing 15 terracotta musicians, and 17 bronze water birds to entertain the emperor in the afterlife. There was also a pit full of stone armor and several pits full of horse skeletons. There was also a rumor that this army is also haunted or cursed. Of course, this makes sense when it comes to ancient relics, as it must have been extremely jarring to walk into a room and see a heck ton of statues just standing there. And if you're afraid of mannequins, this isn't the type of room you'd like to visit. Number 7. Emperor Mercury. Aside the discovery of the Terracotta Army as mentioned in the previous section of this list, you'd be surprised to also find out that the same emperor was buried with rivers of mercury. According to historical records dating back to 2,200 years, the mausoleum chamber of the Terracotta Army, Emperor Qin, contains large amounts of liquid mercury, considered as the elixir of life at the time. During researchers' investigations, the highly volatile mercury may be escaping through the cracks which developed in the structure over time. Aside mercury being considered as an elixir of life, the ancient Chinese believed that ingesting long-lasting mineral substances such as jade, cinnabar, or hematite would confer some of that longevity on the person who consumed them. Gold was also considered particularly potent as it was a non-tarnishing precious metal, and the idea of potable or drinking gold is found in China by the end of the 3rd century BC. Many of these substances, far from contributing to longevity, were actively toxic and resulted in Chinese elixir poisoning. Ancient Chinese historian Sima wrote on the room of the Emperor King that the floor of the central burial chamber floats on rivers, lakes, and seas of Mercury. The vaulted ceiling is inlaid with pearls and gems to emulate the sun and moon and principal stars of the constellations in the night sky. Despite the site being unstable for archaeological expeditions, that must have been a pretty quite sight to see. Number 6, the not-so-forbidden city. To some, it might actually surprise you that the Forbidden City wasn't actually a city but the name of the palace, and it was built as a home for just one guy, one man. As the palace was known as the Forbidden City, has been known to have thousands of rooms, hundreds of buildings just for that one guy, or at least for one family, which is why it was considered a forbidden city. The palace was commissioned by Zhu Di in 1402, shortly after he kicked out his nephew. Zhu Di actually wanted to rule from his own power base in Beijing, which was probably smart given that there was people in the old capital who were really annoyed at him for overthrowing his nephew. Over the next 600 years, 24 different emperors belonging to 2 dynasties would occupy the Forbidden City, and today the Forbidden City is a museum housing more than 1.5 million artifacts. Number 5, Petty Palace. Aside the fact that it took 14 years and roughly 1 million laborers, the Forbidden City, or as we know it now as the Forbidden Palace in itself, was pretty dang remarkable. But its development in itself, in some blocks weighing more than 100 tons from the quarry that was 43 miles away, these blocks would be taken by workers by hand and even during the winter. And between 1271 and 1368, China was ruled by the Mongols. Kublai Khan, who was the 5th emperor of the Yuan dynasty and the grandson of Genghis Khan, the palace was so magnificent that historians made note of it, but after the Yuan dynasty, the entire thing vanished. How? Well, that's because the Forbidden City was built right on top of it. Archaeologists excavating near the center of the palace unearthed the 7th century old foundations of another royal palace, evidence that something just as grand as the Forbidden City had once existed on the same site. Maybe he was jealous, I don't know. Number 4, Forbidden Eunuchs. There was over 70,000 eunuchs living in the palace by the end of the Ming dynasty. Eunuchs were the only non-emperor men who could live in the Forbidden City, mainly because the emperor feared of what would happen if the men intact a little too much time hanging out with his 9,000 concubines. But the real unbelievable thing about Chinese eunuchs is that it was a volunteer workforce. Life outside the palace was so bad apparently that healthy men would volunteer to be parted from their parts in exchange for a life of luxury. Luckily, this was a volunteer position, so if the eunuch in training showed any sign of doubt, the surgeon would just not proceed. Also, they believed in the afterlife you would reunite with your lost body parts, so they would carry theirs in a little tiny bag, and if you lost it, you could borrow it from someone else. Number 3, concubines were stolen. It was dangerous to be beautiful in ancient China. Young and beautiful women were often stolen from their families to serve as the emperor's concubines. Sometimes they were even offered by their families in exchange for political favor, of course. Now, since concubines weren't actually allowed to write home or anything, all that stuff about the harm they've seen, death, and starvation probably wasn't common knowledge, so maybe the families deluded themselves into believing that the life at the palace would be better for their daughters than the life at home. The emperor's concubines lived in isolation from the rest of the world, and they weren't even permitted to see a doctor if they got sick. And just like in ancient Egypt, if you were the favorite of the emperor if he died, baby girl, so would you. And so you would do anything, or whatever you could do, to not be noticed by the emperor. And although you'd want to maintain whatever available luxury was offered, you still wanted to survive as much as possible at the palace. So when the emperor would pass on, those who weren't given the blessed experience of joining him into the afterlife would just retire. They'd go off into getting a career as a nun or laundress, as those were the only real options for girls at the time. Number 2, crime and punishment. When it comes to civilizations of ancient realms, there's always room for some punishment against those who refuse to fall in line. And in this case of the ancient Chinese, they were pretty hardcore with their devices. Although I'd like to go in detail, I can't because of viewer discretion is advised, but here's some that I can mention. One was slowly dropping water onto the prisoner's forehead, and that was about it, really. The incessant and regular dropping of water was a mental rather than physical torture, and the victim themselves never had any relief. If it wasn't enough then, of course there were occasions where they would use acid instead of water, and that was occasionally dropped so often that it would painfully burn the victim instead. This increased the terror as the prisoner would not know if the next drop would be water or acid. Another was a mobile stock similar to that in the European medieval times. No idea who started it first, but essentially the weight of the wood would be based on how heavy your crime was. These and many more extremely hardcore forms of not really to really brutal disciplines were often used during wars or punishments of prisoners who rebelled against the kingdoms and the dynasties that ruled. Ancient China was not immune from foreign invasion 1,000 incursions into its border regions. However, of all the invasions, the ones carried out by the Mongols ranked up there as the fiercest. For about a century or so, ancient China had to defend itself from being overrun by the Mongols to the north of its border, and the wars between the two nations were excessive as they were tragic. So if either or were captured, you can bet they were definitely battered one way more than the other. Number 1. Famines and more famines. Ancient China was no stranger to wars or famines, as it was a recurring event throughout history. In the depths of Taiping Rebellion as an example, as I mentioned earlier, Qing forces surrounded and cut off supplies to the rebel-held city of Anqing. After a grueling 2-year siege, the Qing army penetrated the walls, and what they found inside was really horrifying. The king didn't just uncover evidence that the starving citizens had resorted to consuming one another, but even had economic systems that forced on sales on consumption. You heard me. And its economy was going up, meaning there were records of unearthed listings on the market rate for if one person passed away, that would be 1 kilogram of meat going on for equivalent of 50 pence. Yeah. The king ended the siege of Anqing by getting rid of its entire 8,000 battalions following their surrender. As for the civilians, according to the Cambridge scholars, more than 10,000 women were carried off by the king's soldiers as booty, sparingly, perhaps more than some. What was your favorite on the list? Did you learn anything interesting today? Let me know. Alright, for your next riddle, are you ready? How many months have 28 days? Be sure to put your answer in the comment below and I'll reveal your answer in the next one. Top 10 unusual intimacy practices in ancient China. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe and I'll see your beautiful faces in the next one. Bye!